You're at a party. People are laughing, drinks are flowing, conversations are happening everywhere. And you're standing right in the middle of it all, feeling completely alone. Or maybe it's not a party. Maybe it's a family dinner, a work meeting, a group chat where everyone seems to get each other's jokes except you. And you sit there, smiling at the right moments, nodding when it feels appropriate, doing all the things a person is supposed to do when they belong somewhere. But deep down, there's this quiet voice, this small, persistent feeling that says, you don't quite fit here. And the strange part, it's not just here, it's everywhere. At school, it was there. At work, it's still there. Even in your closest friendships, even with people who genuinely love you, there are these moments where you look around and think, am I the only one who feels like I'm performing belonging instead of actually feeling it? If that's you, I want you to stay with me. Because what I'm about to tell you is not a pep talk. It's not, you just haven't found your people yet. It's something deeper than that. Something that's actually rooted in how your brain is built, how your history shaped you, and why this feeling, as painful as it is, might be pointing to something important about who you are. Let's start with the science of belonging, because it's more serious than most people realize. Psychologist Roy Baumeister spent years studying what he called the need to belong, and his conclusion was stark. He argued that belonging isn't a nice-to-have. It's a fundamental human need, as basic as food or safety. When that need goes consistently unmet, the psychological consequences are real. Anxiety, depression, a chronic low-grade sense that something is wrong with you, even when your life looks fine on the outside. But here's the part that doesn't get talked about enough. Baumeister also found that people experience belonging differently. Some people can walk into a room of strangers and feel connected within minutes. Others can be surrounded by people who love them and still feel a wall of glass between themselves and everyone else. And that gap, that difference in how people experience belonging, it's not random. It's not a personality flaw. It has roots, deep ones. For a lot of people who feel like outsiders everywhere, it started early, not always with one dramatic event, but with a pattern. Maybe you were the kid who thought differently than your classmates, who found the things everyone else cared about a little hollow, who had interests or questions or a way of seeing the world that didn't quite match the template around you. Maybe you moved around a lot growing up. Research shows that children who experience frequent relocations develop what psychologists call a weaker sense of place identity, meaning their sense of self becomes less tied to any specific community or group, which sounds fine in theory. But what it actually creates is a person who never fully lands anywhere, who always feels slightly like a visitor, even in places they've lived for years. Or maybe nothing obvious happened at all. Maybe you just grew up quietly noticing that you process things differently, that you felt things more deeply, that conversations that satisfied everyone else left you wanting something more, something realer. Psychologist Elaine Aron's research on highly sensitive people, or HSPs, found that roughly 15 to 20% of the population has a nervous system that is genuinely wired to process sensory and emotional information more deeply than average. These people aren't dramatic. They're not weak. Their brains literally take in more data per social interaction than most people, which means they're also more likely to notice the gap between what's being said and what's actually happening, between the surface of a conversation and the real feeling underneath it. And when you're that attuned, small talk doesn't just feel boring. It feels like a kind of loneliness. Because you're right there, physically present. But the conversation is happening in a frequency you can't quite tune into. Now, here's where it gets complicated. Because feeling like an outsider isn't just about sensitivity or history. There's also something happening at the level of identity itself. Psychologist Henri Tajfel developed what's called social identity theory in the 1970s. His central argument was that a significant part of how we see ourselves comes from the groups we belong to: our nationality, our profession, our friend group, our family. These aren't just social categories. They're building blocks of self-concept. But what happens when you don't feel like you fully belong to any of them? What happens when you're too much of one thing for one group and too much of another thing for a different group? When you're too intellectual for some spaces and too emotional for others? Too introverted for one crowd and somehow too intense for the quiet ones? You end up living in the margins of multiple worlds without a home base in any of them. Psychologists have a term for this experience. They call it marginal identity. And it's more common than you'd think. It shows up frequently in people who are multiracial, who grew up between cultures, who are neurodivergent, who are exceptionally gifted, or who simply developed a self-concept early on that didn't map neatly onto any available social group. The painful part of marginal identity isn't that you belong nowhere. It's that you belong almost everywhere, but never completely. You can move through different worlds. You can connect with different kinds of people. But there's always a part of you you're holding back. Always something you're not quite saying. Always a version of yourself that doesn't make it into the room. And I want to be honest here, because I think this next part is the one most people need to hear. Sometimes, the outsider feeling isn't just about neurology or identity structure. Sometimes it's a protection strategy. If you experience rejection early, and I don't mean catastrophic rejection necessarily, just the ordinary kind, the friend group that quietly excluded you, the parent who didn't quite understand you, the classroom where you learned that being too much of yourself was a liability, your brain may have made a decision. A quiet, unconscious decision that went something like this: belonging is a risk, and the closer I get, the more it will hurt when it doesn't work out. So instead of fully showing up, you show up partially. You give people a version of you that's edited, curated, safe. And then you wonder why you feel like an outsider, not realizing that you've become one deliberately, not out of coldness, out of self-preservation. Psychologists call this preemptive withdrawal. You pull back before you can be pushed. You keep a little distance so the fall isn't as far. And the tragic irony is that this strategy, designed to protect you from loneliness, is often what manufactures it. But here's the part I really want you to sit with, because I think it changes everything. The people who feel like outsiders everywhere, the ones who never fully land, who always notice the gap, who hold a part of themselves back, these people often develop something that people who easily belong never have to build: a self that exists independently of external validation. Think about it. If you'd always been welcomed, always fit in, always had a group that mirrored your identity back to you, you'd never have been forced to develop a relationship with yourself that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. You'd never have had to build an inner life rich enough to sustain you when the outside world wasn't offering much. Philosopher Albert Camus once wrote about the stranger, the person who exists slightly outside the social world, observing it rather than being absorbed by it. And what Camus understood was that this position, as uncomfortable as it is, also produces a particular kind of clarity, a lucidity about human behavior, a resistance to groupthink, an ability to see things as they actually are rather than as the group agrees they should be. Research backs this up in interesting ways. A 2015 study published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found that people who reported lower feelings of group belonging tended to score significantly higher on measures of independent thinking and self-directed motivation. They were less susceptible to social conformity pressure, less likely to change their opinions based on what the group believed. In other words, the outsider position, as painful as it is, forges something. It forces you to know yourself in a way that comfort never would. So where does that leave you? If you're someone who has spent years feeling like a visitor in rooms where everyone else seems at home, I'm not going to tell you that feeling is something to get over, or that it means you're broken, or that the right community will fix it. The feeling of being an outsider is, in part, a signal. It's your nervous system telling you that you are not willing to disappear into a group to feel accepted, that you notice when connection isn't real, that you need something more specific, more genuine, more honest than what most social environments offer. That's not a defect. That's a standard, a high one, an uncomfortable one that will cost you easy belonging for a long time, but also one that, when you finally find the people and the spaces that meet it, and they exist, they're just rarer, will feel like something you've never felt before. Not performing belonging, actually feeling it. The outsider who stops running from what they are doesn't become a person who fits in everywhere. They become a person who fits genuinely and completely in the places that were actually built for them. And maybe that's always been the difference. Not finding a place to belong, finding out who you actually are first, and then seeing where that person is welcomed. If this hits something in you, there's a reason. Click the next video. We're just getting started.